You fix things before anyone asks you to. Does not matter what it is. An inconsistency in a junior officer's source report, a small but operationally consequential gap in an internal assessment, a colleague's analytical drift that is about to hit the inbox of a deputy who will not be as forgiving. You just handle it, quietly, efficiently, like there is some internal checklist running in the background that never shuts off. And if someone notices and thanks you for it, you wave it off, brush past it, maybe crack a small joke. Because to you, that is not something worth mentioning. That is just what you do. If you came of age inside the intelligence trade between roughly 1985 and 2000, you are part of a very specific slice of the modern service, the mid-cohort, the ones who did not just train under the post-war veterans, you worked beside them. You remember them. The carbon paper case files, the teletype rooms, the compartments where everything was still done on paper because magnetic media was not yet trusted for the most sensitive material. You were the last operatives in Western intelligence whose first decade in the trade did not happen on a networked terminal. You were trained on the honor system. The senior officer asked you what was in the file, and you knew because you had read it, on paper, in a vault. Today, the conversation is about what makes this particular operations officer tick, where those silent fixer instincts came from, what you were taught, how it shaped your decisions, and what separates your experience from the operatives trained even 5 or 6 years after you, because that gap is bigger than internal histories tend to acknowledge. Let us start with the station you trained inside, not the layout, the rules. If you joined the trade in the mid-1980s or early 1990s, your senior officers were most likely the Cold War cohort or the late OSS-trained generation that had survived into the modern service. And the rules in that station were not flexible. There was a right way to handle a source meeting and a wrong way. There was what you were supposed to do with an inconsistency in a debrief and what happened if you did not. The explanations were short. Sometimes they did not exist at all. You were told to respect chain of command. Not some seniors, all of them. The chief of station, the deputy, the cable officer who had been at the same posting since before you finished training. You did not talk back, you did not make excuses. And if somebody corrected your tradecraft, you took it. That was the deal. For operatives in field assignments specifically, there was another layer. You were taught, not only in words but in everything you observed, that an officer handles their business. They produce. They do not complain. They do not ask for institutional help unless a source is exposed. You watched your senior officers, your station chief, the case officers on your division, and that is what they modeled. Show up, do the work, keep the operational stress to yourself. Nobody called it brittle back then. Nobody called it anything. It was just how the trade worked. And here's the thing. A lot of those lessons stuck, not because you sat down at 40 and decided to adopt them, because they were loaded into your operational system before you even had the vocabulary to question them. You still show up at the station before anyone else. You still fix the analytical report without being asked. You still measure your professional worth by what you produce, not by how you feel about producing it. And on the surface, those seem like good operational traits, reliable, dependable, useful to the service. But there is a cost, and it takes about 30 decades to see it. Because what they never taught you is what to do when you are operationally tired, not physically tired. You know how to push through that. Operationally tired. The kind of tired where you have been holding the analytical line for so long that your assessments no longer flinch, they just go through. A lot of mid-cohort officers hit their 50s and realize they have been running a program that does not have a rest function. You know how to do the work. You know how to show up. You know how to take a difficult institutional hit and keep moving. What you do not always know is how to say, I need to step back from this case for a week, because that was never in the operational script. Now, let us talk about the analog era for a moment. Because when you came into the trade, the operational world moved at a different speed, literally.
You did not have a networked terminal until you were already running cases. You did not have a personal communications device the service was tracking until well into your mid-career. When you needed to access a piece of intelligence, you went to the file vault, you requisitioned the document, you read it in the room, and you signed out before you left. The tradecraft you absorbed was physical: carbon copies, sealed envelopes, cable templates, maps drawn by hand at the station because the resolution of available imagery was inadequate. You operated through 3 channels, maybe 4 if a friendly liaison had something to add, and you shared that operational picture with everyone on your division because there was nothing else to read. That is why your nostalgia for the trade hits differently than the younger officers' nostalgia. The cohort that joined after 2005 grew up in the post-network era. Digitized files were already normal by the time they finished training. The classified network was their first language. Their tradecraft references are pixelated. Yours are paper. You remember the tail end of the Cold War on the cable traffic. You remember the night Berlin opened. You remember when the agency's Soviet/Eastern Europe division was suddenly the most institutionally important office in the building, and then, a few years later, suddenly was not. The younger cohort caught these institutional shifts in retrospective oral histories, if they caught them at all. You were in the room. You remember the year of the spy in 1985, or at least the institutional shockwave it left behind. You do not remember the specific compartmented exposures in fine detail, maybe. You were junior, but you remember the tone, the way senior officers talked about a service that had been more penetrated by the adversary than the previous administration had been willing to admit. That ambient institutional skepticism did not come from a training module. It came from the wardroom at 1900 hours after a long debrief.
And that matters more than the institutional histories tend to recognize, because by the time you were in your mid-career, you already carried this low-level operational understanding that the institutional environment was not necessarily structured to look out for you, that senior judgment could be wrong, that the officers in command did not always deserve the chair they were sitting in. That attitude shaped your work ethic. You did not work hard because you believed in the agency abstractly. You worked hard because you believed in your own analytical and operational judgment. You figured if institutional things fell apart, and institutional things do fall apart, you would need to be the one whose tradecraft still stood up. The Sandy Grimes and Jean Verta field case is the canonical example of this. 2 career CIA officers, both quietly working in the agency's counterintelligence center across the late 1980s and early 1990s, both nearing the end of operationally significant careers, both convinced from internal pattern data that an unidentified mole was still operating inside the directorate even after the public consensus had moved on from that possibility. Their work, documented in Grimes and Vertafield's book Circle of Treason and in the FBI's published case summary on the Ames investigation, was largely uncelebrated for years. They were not running operations. They were not collecting from sources. They were sitting in a room with paper going through old case files, looking for the inconsistency that everyone else had rationalized. Aldrich Ames was arrested in February 1994 in significant part because of the analytical labor of 2 officers nobody outside the building had heard of, doing the work that the institutional structure had not asked them to do. That is the silent fixer cohort at its operational peak: quiet, patient, uncredited. Right. According to internal personnel research conducted across multiple Western services in the 2010s and partially summarized in unclassified workforce reports, the trait that consistently scores highest among mid-cohort intelligence officers is not analytical aggressiveness. It is operational self-control.
The capacity to manage one's own attention, hold an internal position over years without external validation, and continue running a case file through institutional indifference. You learned to manage yourself before anyone gave you a senior title. That self-control shows up everywhere, in how you handle conflict with the directorate, in how you spend operational resources, in how you mentor, which is probably the place where your training and your senior officer choices collide hardest. Because a lot of mid-cohort officers are now mentoring the exact opposite of how they were trained. Not because they hated their early career, most of them did not, but because they noticed the gaps, the things nobody said, the debrief conversations that never happened, the questions you had that nobody answered. Not because the senior cohort did not care, but because the operational culture of their generation did not think those conversations were necessary. So now you talk to your junior officers, you explain things, you try to make the invisible parts of the trade visible. And sometimes it works, and sometimes your trainees stare at you like you are reading from a tradecraft manual they did not ask for. Here is where it gets interesting though, because the mid-cohort officer is sitting in a very specific institutional seat right now. You are not the senior cohort, you are not the junior cohort. You are in the spot where the institutional handoff lands on you at once. Rand Corporation's succession research finds that more than half of senior mid-cohort officers in the Western services right now are simultaneously managing 2 retiring mentors and 3 to 5 rising trainees, on top of an active caseload. For mid-cohort officers specifically, it is even more layered, because many of you took your operational portfolios late. You came into your most significant work in your 40s. So now you have a complex active case file and a transitioning mentor cohort and a rising junior tier. And you are managing all of it while still producing, still showing up, still holding the analytical line. And a significant share of officers in that institutional position report being functionally always rushed. Not sometimes, always. But here is what nobody is documenting in the workforce briefings. You do not complain about it, because the wiring from your early service, the Handle Your Business programming, is still running. You absorb the institutional pressure. You adjust the schedule.
You sign off on the junior officer's draft, then move to the mentor consultation, then sit in a cable review, wondering when the last time you did something operationally for yourself was. And if someone asks how you're doing, you say, fine. That word does a lot of heavy lifting in your operational vocabulary. Let us talk about what separates you from the younger cohort, because it is more than just intake year. The officers who joined after 2005 came up in a different institutional window. They had networked classified systems from the start. They had digital tradecraft instruction by their second training rotation. The post-Snowden environment hit while they were still in the early years of their careers. Their relationship with technical infrastructure is more native. Not like the cyber operations specialists, they still remember some of the analog tradecraft, but they did not have to cross the same operational bridge you did. You went from paper cable to digital cable, from handwritten case notes to encrypted databases, from a physical file room to a networked search interface. And you adapted quickly, but you adapted the way someone learns a second operational language, fluently, but always aware it is not your first one. That shows up in how you use the technical infrastructure now. You do not merge your operational identity with it. You do not run every assessment through the algorithmic recommendation. You do not need the technical platform to validate an analytical judgment. You use the tools, but you do not rely on them. And there's a confidence in that, a quiet one. The younger officers are a little more deeply integrated with the platform. They are more likely to defer to the system's pattern detection. They are more likely to rely on automated indicators in places where you would still cross-check manually. Not dramatically different, they are still operationally competent, but the gap is there. They came up with more tools, more channels, more processed signal. Your early career had fewer inputs, and that made the ones you had hit harder. When you read a paper cable from 1989, it does not just bring back a memory, it brings back a temperature, the smell of the file room, the exact weight of that afternoon, because you were not splitting your attention across 6 classified terminals, you were in the room. Your brain recorded the operation in high resolution because there was nothing competing with it.
Now, what have you learned?
Because you have learned things, hard things, things your senior cohort would not have admitted out loud. And here is what separates the mid-cohort officer from the operative you were 20 years ago. You have started to sort out what was a tradecraft lesson and what was a limitation that the era happened to write into the curriculum. The work ethic stayed. The resilience stayed. The capacity to stay analytically composed when everything around you is loud, those are real. Those serve you. But the idea that asking for institutional help is operational weakness, you have started to let that go. Maybe not all the way, maybe not in front of the directorate, but enough to know it is not true. The idea that your own operational well-being does not matter as long as the caseload is moving, that one cracked around 45 and split wide open by 50. You realized your sustainability was not a luxury, it was connected to everything else. Your analytical clarity, your tradecraft, your ability to be present for the work you spent your career building. You also learned something about institutional friendship that took decades to name. When you were junior, professional connection was proximity. It was the cohort on your training rotation, the officers on your division, the analysts you worked beside. You did not have to try, it just happened. Now, it does not just happen. You have to make it happen. And that is harder than it sounds for a cohort of officers who were never taught how to maintain institutional relationships outside the operational requirement. You know how to show up for a case. You know how to show up for a directorate function. Showing up for a former case partner on a Tuesday night just because you want to talk through a piece of trade, that is newer territory. But the officers who figure it out will tell you it changes everything. Because the loneliest version of a mid-cohort officer is not the one who is operationally alone. It is the one who is institutionally surrounded and still carrying every analytical position by themselves. The silent fixer officer is not obsolete. He is not a relic. He is not some cautionary archetype about outdated tradecraft. He is an operative who was handed a set of professional tools in his 20s, used them to build a career, and is now standing back and asking which tools still work and which ones need to be retired. That takes more institutional courage than the published histories tend to credit.
Because tearing the trade down and starting over, that is dramatic, but it is easy to articulate. Sorting through a lifetime of operational habits and quietly upgrading the ones that no longer serve the mission while keeping the ones that still do, that is precision work. That is tradecraft maturity, and that is exactly what the mid-cohort officer is doing right now, whether the directorate notices or not. You do not need the institutional credit. You never did. But it is worth hearing that what you are doing is more substantial than it looks, and the fact that you are doing it quietly does not make it less real. You were built to last, and the best part, you are still building.